Hello, and welcome back to part 2 of this podcast, which is about a media tour to Xinjiang. I'm Kim Bergman, the editor of Asia Pacific Defence Reporter, and the last podcast ended up with the group leaving Urumqi, heading for Kashgar. The Chinese prefer the name Kashi. Kashgar is in the very furthest southwest corner of the Xinjiang autonomous region, and so not very far from the borders of Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan and Afghanistan, and there'll be much more on Afghanistan a bit later, and also Pakistan. All of those countries are majority Islamic nations. Now, Kashgar is one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities on Earth because it's such an old Silk Road town, and it has variously been under the rule of the Chinese Empire, the Turkic Empire, the Mongols, the Tibetans. It has been under Chinese rule since the 19th century, though there were even periods, such as in the very early 20th century, when the British used it as an important staging post for their campaign against what they believed was Russian imperial expansion. So a truly multicultural city with a lot of history. It has a population of about 700,000, most of whom, or the majority of whom, are Uyghurs, which is quite a contrast with Urumqi, where the majority are the Han Chinese. We arrived around midnight, and I might say what a relief it is to be staying in a government-owned hotel where you don't have to bother with the tedium of check-in. You just go to your pre-allocated room. Of course, in my case, I went to the wrong one, which I found out the next morning, but it doesn't matter at all. Now, Kashgar appears to be a vibrant, multicultural city, and contrary to many people's expectations in the West, there was no heavy-handed security, or for that matter, not much security at all. Now, that might be partly offset by the number of surveillance cameras around the place, but they are a worldwide feature, and you get them in Australian cities as well. I have to say, of course, it wasn't like this during the big security crackdowns of 2014 and 2017 that I referenced in the first podcast and in my article on this, something that the Chinese tour organisers themselves referred to quite discreetly. But I've also been in contact with someone who was there at the time, and they describe a fairly nightmarish sounding scene of police lights and sirens going 24 hours a day and lots of constant shouting over loudspeakers. Thankfully, there was absolutely none of that. And even though our program was scripted, as all of these things are, we could and did wander off and have a look around for ourselves without being hindered in any way whatsoever. Okay, to the program itself. With our first morning, it started with a very pleasant visit to the old part of Kashi, or Kashgar. There was an opening ceremony. I understand that takes place on most mornings. That's half an hour of bands and people in traditional costumes, dancing and singing. All of that sort of very spectacular. We also had, I think from memory, it was morning tea with some traditional Uzbek hospitality, food, dancing, all of those sorts of things, and it didn't need to be so directly, but obviously, if there was some sort of problem with Uyghur culture, we wouldn't be seeing as much as we did. Next, we headed for a local kindergarten in a village on the outskirts of town that catered for the children of Uyghur farmers. And it's always fun visiting these sorts of places. There are about, I think from memory, 271 children, very enthusiastic teachers. Sometimes, you'd have a minimum of 2 teachers per class, one teaching Mandarin, the other teaching the Uyghur language. Sometimes there'd be a third teacher there who I understood to be a sort of an auxiliary who'd also help do things like prepare halal meals for all of the kids. They got breakfast, they got lunch, they got a snack. They were leaving to go home. We, of course, asked what the Uyghur parents thought of this, and the answer was they love it because many of them, being a rural area, both parents are working, and so they just really like the idea that the kids are looked after and particularly that they get fed. Now, after that, back to the hotel, then pretty heavy-duty lecture on economic development for the Uyghur people. That was sort of university level statistics, facts, figures, graphs, all the rest of it. The quick takeaway from an almost 2-hour talk was that since around the year 2000, the government of China has been making a concerted effort to lift the income of the Uyghur people, as I say, most of whom are in rural areas, and it's succeeding. The level of income inequality is declining. Not all problems have been eliminated. The presenters were very open about that, saying that gaps remain, but all of the trends are good, and they're going to continue to work down this path so that eventually poor people in rural areas will be able to enjoy, well, they'll no longer be poor because they'll be enjoying the same standard of living of people in the cities. After that, we headed for, again, another rural area where experimentation was taking place growing rice in very saline conditions, something that might be of interest for Australian researchers. Then back to the hotel, then that was it, fairly late finish. Next day, we started with a fairly detailed lecture first of all was a visit to the main mosque. Again, happy to wander around, talk to the head of the mosque. It would appear that, yes, religious freedom is being practiced, and again, not only by people of the Islamic faith, but also Buddhists, Christians, and one or two other groups. We had a further very detailed history of religion and religious practices in China that, despite, some historical ups and downs, the message was pretty clear that by law, people are allowed to practice whatever religion they want, with the proviso, that's true for just about all societies, that religious practices have to be within the framework of the law of the country. After that, it was a visit to the Hospital of Traditional Chinese Medicine, something that I'm quite familiar with, but I'm not sure that many other members of the group were, so they were fascinated by acupuncture and things like that. We had dinner at a local restaurant. This was, I think, one of only 2 occasions when we didn't have the buffet at the hotel. It was a local Uyghur restaurant and, big platters of traditional food, lots of lamb and sheep and things like that, and a bit of folk dancing and all of that sort of thing. Back to the hotel for another late finish. The next day, as we were departing Kashgar on our way to the airport, we dropped into a community centre, and these sorts of things will be of interest for some Australians because it's, Chinese society under communism is quite different. There's no doubt about that. There's an emphasis on collective welfare rather than individual rights, and this community centre, which was very representative of a number of them that we'd seen, was a sort of integrated facility with old people living in close proximity to the centre itself, but it also had basketball courts and things like that to encourage young people to come and mingle. Sociologists would be very, very interested because, unlike in Western societies where old people are shipped off somewhere, this was an attempt, with, I'd have to say, a fair degree of success from what I could see, bringing a whole lot of people together. And the community centre also had medical facilities, and even a small cafeteria. Then it was off to the airport, and for about the 3rd time, I got the very back seat in the aircraft. I mentioned this in passing just to disabuse of anyone of the thought that this was some sort of luxury tour. It was not. We then arrived in Ili, sometimes known as Yili, which used to be the old capital of the entire region. It's now the capital of the Kazakh autonomous prefecture, but originally it was an outpost, often staffed by exiles resisting the expansion of Imperial Russia. This was back in the 18th century. And it's about 2 hours flight north of Kashgar. Kashgar itself was kind of 2 hours southwest of Urumqi, which is kind of in the middle of the prefecture. Anyway, the Ili prefecture borders on Kazakhstan, Mongolia, and Russia. And in contrast to Kashgar and Urumqi, the ethnic presence of Kyrgyz, Kazakh, and Russian people is very obvious, and I assume that was why it was included in the tour. At the end of the Second World War, the Soviet Union tried, and to an extent succeeded, influencing the internal politics of Xinjiang, which caused a lot of friction with the Communist Party of China, and that even extended after the CPC victory of 1949. And that feeds into another interest of mine, the geopolitics of the region. And my very quick summary is that the economic growth of China is acting as a giant magnet of influence on all of Central Asia, at the same time as Russia's power is declining, thanks entirely to the stupidity of their brutal invasion of Ukraine. Now, I'm really cantering through all of this, and Italy, by the way, is very scenic, beautiful part of the world, but we also visited a company in kind of a high-tech park about an hour out of the city that's specializing in renewable technology, and we also squeezed in history such as a visit to the original governor's mansion that was running the place from midway through the 18th century onwards, then back to the airport, then back to Urumqi for the final part of the tour. And I wanted to leave a bit of space for this, even though this is at the very end of the podcast. I'm doing this chronologically. For me, possibly the most consequential part of the tour, and that was a visit to something called the Exhibition of Counterterrorism and Deradicalisation in Xinjiang. And I've touched on this several times, and I think to really have a good understanding of the bad press that China has received over the treatment of Uyghur people. A number of allegations have been made, not a lot of them have been proven, but they all relate to these security crackdowns that I've referred to repeatedly. And this exhibition centre, not open to the public, thankfully, because it contained a lot of material, including closed-circuit TVs, including police photographs, police videos, and it was pretty brutal. It was a lot of stuff of people being shot and of explosions and fire bombings and things like that. Could this stuff have been manufactured? Well, a cynic might think that, but if you go to the internet, a wonderful tool in the right hands, you can cross-check a lot of this, and yes, just about all of the terrorism incidents detailed in the museum, as I say, usually illustrated with, hard evidence in the form of interviews on camera with people who were, victims or whatever, plus closed-circuit TV. These episodes started in the early 1990s and increased in intensity. And I suppose the only thing that surprises me a little bit is that it took China as long as it did to crack down to the extent that was necessary, because by 2014, there are estimates that up to 10,000 people could have been killed in these cumulative episodes, some of which, as I say, were quite high profile. There was an attack on Tiananmen Square that was internationally recognized because it just happened that Western news networks have a presence in Beijing, but also on various railway stations. Airport security that I mentioned before in Urumqi was very strict because of a couple of attempted hijackings. And when you put all of that together, it really does start to put everything into sharp relief. And as I say, I'm not sure why it was left to the very end. Perhaps in the minds of the Chinese organizers, they wanted to do it in sort of a logical sequence to show us as much of the good side as they could, and then at the very end show the darker reason why the government had found it necessary to take the actions that they did. And I have to say, that made sense not only to me, but also to the other journalists and media people who were part of the tour, many of whom, by the way, themselves were from the region and were of the Islamic faith. And that leads me to, I suppose, for me, one of the big takeaways on the security side of things, and that is how the Chinese government views the future of Xinjiang. And what I can say in summary, and this didn't come directly from a senior official, this is sort of the cumulative view that I formed speaking with a number of subject matter experts, both during official presentations and during the side conversations that you have during these sorts of things, when you're with people, every day for 8 days and you mingle and you get to know each other better. And that is, there is a real concern about a serious return of Islamic fundamentalism, and a key driver of that is the return to power of the Taliban in Afghanistan in 2022. This has come at a time when the central government was pretty convinced that they had everything in Xinjiang under control, not only from a heavy-handed security point of view, but they were starting to make good progress with their various cultural and economic development programs. Many of the economic programs, by the way, are concerned with green energy, so that was another sort of progressive theme in all of this. So the fear of Islamic fundamentalism is driven by several things, including factors such as there are 15,000 Uyghurs currently believed to be in Syria. 5,000 of them are fighters. The other 10,000 are family members and associates. They went to Syria to fight with al-Qaeda against the Assad regime, and the fear is that they will gradually make their way back home, radicalized and with a whole lot of combat training. Now, there's also been instability in Iran, which neighbors Afghanistan. The Iranians have recently repatriated, people would unkindly say kicked out, about 2 million Afghans. Now it's thought that some of them also are radicalized extremists. They might also be tempted to cross the border and make life difficult. So this is, if you like, the darker side of the situation. Chinese people believe as well that the terrorists in future could seek to disrupt the Belt and Road Initiative. Threats have already been made on attacks on pipelines and things like that. So and by the way, I'm getting towards the end of this. I should also say, no one should be discouraged from visiting Xinjiang. On the contrary, this is a firm recommendation of mine. You can book flights directly from Australia. As an Australian, if you're going to be in China for less than 30 days, you don't even need a visa. You can book your connecting flight to Urumqi. So this notion that some people have that it's a closed-off zone is just not true at all. People are very welcoming, very friendly, and very, very keen on tourism. But I'm just concluding on that national security point to try and explain the seriousness with which China is taking the situation. And at the moment, they will continue, as far as I can tell, with sort of a two-track approach, continue with the economic development of the Uyghurs. They believe that if they continue to lift people out of poverty, respect their cultural heritage, respect their language, respect their religion, it is less likely that they will be radicalized, especially by outside actors, but at the same time, they're going to invest very heavily in surveillance technology, particularly of the border areas, to try and minimize the prospect of bad actors ever returning to Xinjiang and causing the level of disruption that they did for about a 20-year period. Thank you very much for listening. If anyone is interested in more details about Xinjiang, contact me because there's a lot more information that I have.